Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Gabby, and I'm going to be talking with you all this evening about my work with individuals who have survived some of the life's most profound challenges, and my work as a trauma therapist in training and a memory researcher. I wanted to start by opening with this quote that means a lot to me from Nelson Mandela, which is, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." Whether I'm wearing my therapist hat or my researcher hat, my goal is to really come alongside survivors of trauma and express just this sentiment that recovery or resilience doesn't mean that you never experience fear. It means that you're committed to living a meaningful life despite it. And I feel this lesson applies to much of the existential fears in our world, which is how I came to have a particular focus on the intersection of climate change and trauma recovery, which is what we'll be spending our time talking about this evening. But let me first back up a little bit. So what do I mean by trauma? In the field of psychology, this is a word that refers to those life experiences that cause us to fear intensely for our safety or the safety of close others. This definition includes things like interpersonal violence, life-threatening car wrecks, or narrowly escaping a devastating fire. Last summer was one of the most devastating fire seasons on record in Washington state. The Gray and Oregon fires, which primarily burned in Spokane County, destroyed or damaged over 800 homes and claimed 2 lives. The impact of wildfires were felt globally last summer. We can think about the examples in Lahaina, the Canary Islands, and Turkey, to name just a few. The likelihood of fires occurring is only increasing due to climate change, due to drier and windier conditions that make it harder to manage fires when they do appear. And this threatens our physical and our mental health. So I want you to imagine someone enjoying a summer here in Washington state. They're aware of a wildfire in their area for which they've been told to evacuate from their home on and off for the past few weeks. They get the message that the wildfire is spreading quickly in their direction, and they hop in their car. Maybe they're speeding to daycare to pick up a family member. Maybe they aren't able to get the family dog in the car. Maybe they don't have time to grab cherished belongings or family photos. Maybe once they hit the highway entrance, they're met with a wall of black smoke, unsure what's waiting on the other side. Maybe they sustain serious burns and have to be airlifted to Seattle. Mental health problems are incredibly common in the immediate aftermath of an event like this and other traumatic events. This can include a large range of mental health symptoms that make up substance use disorders, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm particularly interested in post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which is a disorder that's characterized by a pattern of distressing, unwanted memories of the trauma that appear when the survivor least wants them. And that might be coming up out of the blue, or it could be cued by something in the individual's environment. Maybe in this case, we might imagine it being the smell of smoke. Additionally, we see persistent avoidance of those things that remind an individual of the trauma. Maybe that's driving miles out of the way to avoid the highway ramp that one took to evacuate. Additionally, we see changes in thoughts and mood. This might be viewing the world as an impossibly dangerous place, or potentially blaming oneself for not evacuating sooner. And finally, we have a cluster of hyperarousal symptoms. That includes things like difficulty sleeping, feeling on edge, feeling irritable, or having angry outbursts. The tremendously hopeful piece in all of this is while mental health problems are common after a traumatic event, in many people, the symptoms will decrease over time. So I wanted to walk through a couple of the pathways that these symptoms can take. So here on the x-axis, I'm showing you time, and on the y-axis, we're looking at symptom severity. In the first pathway, which I'll call the chronic pathway, PTSD symptoms are rising precipitously right around the time of the trauma. They start high and they stay high over time. I think this is a lot of times what we think of when we think of trauma exposure. But you might be surprised to learn that this represents roughly about 10% of folks exposed to trauma within our research studies. Another pathway we might consider is the resilient stable pathway, or we can call it. And in this pathway, individuals never quite reach symptoms that might be diagnosed as PTSD. That doesn't mean they're not experiencing profound feelings of loss, fear, anxiety. We just might not, the symptoms might not come in at the level that we would diagnose with PTSD. A lot of people are surprised to hear that this pathway actually represents about 65% of people exposed to trauma. So truly, this is the most common response. A third pathway we might consider, we can call the delayed pathway. In this pathway, there's somewhat of a rise of symptoms around the time of the trauma typically, but it takes a number of months before symptoms reach that same level as the chronic group, usually six or more months. This is the group we probably know the least about, and it represents about 6 to 7% of individuals exposed to trauma. And then the final pathway that I want to talk about is the group that I'm really interested in, that we can call the resilient recovery group. In the resilient recovery group, we're seeing, again, that precipitous rise in PTSD symptoms around the time of the trauma. And then those symptoms come down over time on their own. In between the resilient recovery group and the resilient stable group, we're looking at about 85% of individuals exposed to trauma. So again, this is really the most common response. Unfortunately, understanding who will land on which of these pathways is a much more difficult question. And it's a really important question from a public health standpoint, because as you can imagine, disasters tend to affect entire communities. So we're in a period where many individuals are going to be experiencing symptoms and potentially wanting mental health resources, but there's also a high potential that our mental health infrastructure has been impacted, whether that means our therapists experiencing mental health problems of their own or impact to our facilities. And so we have this kind of mismatch of high need and fewer resources than we typically would have. So understanding who will sustain chronic symptoms over time and separating those folks from individuals whose symptoms we might expect to come down on their own is really important for getting our limited resources to the people who could benefit from them the most. It might also help us understand what are the processes that are working in favor of our resilient recovery and resilient stable groups, so we could potentially harness those processes and work them into interventions to help our chronic and delayed folks get onto that recovery pathway. So what do we know about predicting PTSD? Here on this slide, I'm showing 5 of the biggest, most useful predictors of PTSD that we have. The larger and darker the circle, the more powerful the predictor is. As you can see, lack of social support and higher life stress in the time following a trauma are the biggest predictors of PTSD that we have. Additionally, we're seeing prior mental health problems and past trauma exposure, as well as the severity of the trauma exposure are predictors, but particularly relevant to social support and life stress, they're relatively small. And so what I want you to take away from this slide is that the best predictors we know of with PTSD are those things that are happening after the event. And that's actually a really beautiful thing because that means we may have some power to change those things. Our mental health trajectories are not written in stone, and in fact, they're primarily built in the time following a trauma. We need more research on predictors of PTSD and particularly modifiable factors that we could potentially work into interventions. One really promising area of research along those lines is post-trauma memory processing. And so I want to propose to you all tonight that the very act of remembering can change what we remember most from a traumatic event. Research in cognitive and clinical psychology has demonstrated a really robust effect where each time we remember a particular detail from a memory, we're more likely to remember that detail in the future when that memory is activated. This maybe isn't that surprising to you. This is the kind of old adage of practice makes perfect. This can be problematic if the things that we're remembering in the days and weeks following a trauma are not that helpful for our recovery process. It's a bit like setting out on a walk after you've just moved to a new neighborhood. So we might look up and find ourselves kind of marching along a busy, roaring highway or through a street with potholes or maybe down a dark, cold alley. This might mean remembering those details that make us feel helpless, at fault, and like the event is bound to repeat itself. The path we choose on the first day can have a really profound impact on the path we choose the next day and the day after that, and over time, this might become our regular route through our neighborhood. And in the same way, we might be inadvertently limiting our memory of a traumatic event to the details that keep us stuck. So what do we want our wildfire survivor thinking about in the time following a trauma? What pieces of the memory are most helpful to be retrieving? Well, that's a really hotly debated topic with a notable limited empirical set of empirical evidence. I was really interested in two particular types of details that individuals might be retrieving in the time following a trauma. And the first is context. And by this, I mean all of those details that surround a traumatic event, whether that's temporal, spatial, environmental, social information. It might be something like remembering the public safety alerts in the days prior to the fire that separate the day of the wildfire from any other summer day in Washington. We think actively remembering the context around an event helps our brains link that event to a specific time and place in our past, making it less likely that those memories will be activated by sort of innocuous types of information in our environment, like driving down the street that an individual took to evacuate the fire. Another type of way that individuals might be thinking after a traumatic event is focusing on the gist or central thematic details of a trauma. This might be remembering the heat beaming through the car window or the moments of driving down a smoky street. Actively remembering the gist to the exclusion of context can end up building an overly general memory that's more easily cued by things in our environment, like potentially feeling heat from a safe source. So I was really interested in this question of whether intentionally retrieving context or gist could shape the way we remember a trauma over time. So our team conducted a lab study that examined individuals' reactions to a distressing 10-minute video rather than an actual trauma. And this is a procedure we use to examine potential interventions in a non-clinical, less vulnerable population. And the idea is that we examine how folks respond to this much lower dose stressor, the distressing video, which gives us more evidence for trying out these ideas later in a more vulnerable population. Of course, in a study like this, informed consent is really important. And so prior to participating in this study, all potential participants were given really detailed information about the procedures in the study, including detailed information about what is depicted in the film that we showed them. So after consenting to participate, our 87 participants watched a short video taken from a popular TV show that depicts an assault, including the context leading up to and following the event. For the next few hours after viewing the film, we prompted participants to remember different details from the film. In our first group, our participants were prompted to remember contextual details, which we defined as details coming before or after the assault in the film. An example of this is, what does the main character tell his mom about his day at school? In our next group, or our GIST condition, participants were prompted to remember details from the assault itself, like how many attackers were involved in the assault. And finally, in our control condition, participants were prompted to remember information from the study that wasn't related to the film itself, like how did you learn you were eligible to participate in this study? This control group gives us a kind of baseline to understand what folks' reactions are like, regardless of whether we're kind of leading them to retrieve different types of information from the film. So after receiving these text message prompts for the few hours following the film, beginning that evening for the next 3 days, we asked participants to let us know if they'd experienced intrusive memories, and if so, how distressing and how vivid their intrusive memories were. These are 2 key predictors of intrusive memories over time, and they're our main outcomes in this study. So what did we find? Let's start with memory distress. So this is the distress associated with intrusive memories as reported by our participants. And on the x-axis, I'm showing day of follow-up, and on the y-axis, we're seeing participants' self-reported distress associated with their memories of the film. And we'll start with the control group. So just like we might expect, the control group is reporting that their highest distress is occurring on the first day of follow-up, but that distress comes down pretty quickly after that by day 3 and certainly by day 4. And next we'll look at the context group. Remember, we're suggesting that retrieving the context of the film is going to be a benefit to our participants, that they're going to report less distress relative to our control. And in fact, that's exactly what we saw. So just by these simple text message prompts after watching the film, participants are demonstrating less distress associated with their intrusive memories over our 3 days of follow-up. And then finally, we'll look at our GIST condition. Remember, we said that retrieving the GIST might lead to an overly general memory and thus more distress associated with their memories relative to our control. But actually, our GIST condition looked really, really similar to our context condition, and there was no significant difference between those 2 groups. But likewise, GIST is reporting significantly less distress than our control group. Okay, now let's look at our memory vividness outcome. That picture looks really similar to our distress figure there. And indeed, the context and GIST groups were not significantly different from each other, but participants in those 2 conditions reported that their intrusive memories were less vivid than those in the control group. So again, with just 6 prompts in the hours following the film, retrieving different elements of the film facilitated less distressing and less vivid intrusive memories relative to our control. However, the relationship between the context and GIST group is a little bit different than we expected. And so what do we make of this? Well, one idea is that maybe our retrieval conditions were acting like a mini exposure therapy for our participants. We were actively encouraging participants to approach their memories of the film rather than avoid them. And as you'll remember from the beginning of this presentation, avoidance is a key symptom of PTSD, and it more generally maintains distress and anxiety over time. So it's possible that we're encouraging this really beneficial approach behavior in both groups. So I want to return to the question of why this all matters. The potential for us to shape the characteristics of what is most remembered and how trauma is remembered over time holds this really important potential for the development of brief, low-burden interventions. This work suggests that it could be worth exploring the possibility of an intervention that doesn't look very different from what we did in this study with our non-clinical population, where we're gently encouraging folks to retrieve the pieces of their memory that is most likely to help them recover in the time following trauma. And again, this is really important in a disaster setting where our resources are low, but our need might be great. And if there's anything that you take away from this talk, I hope it's that recovery of all kinds is possible, whether that's recovery in the community where your symptoms come down over time, or whether that's recovery through a brief intervention like the one I proposed today, or whether that's recovery through our very effective existing PTSD treatments for chronic symptoms. And I'll just come back to this quote briefly that I opened with. Hopefully tonight I've demonstrated that our mental health recovery is not defined by the presence of distress, but how we as a community show up to distress when it appears. So thank you to the University of Washington Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress, where I'm receiving my training, as well as the UW Engage team and Town Hall for allowing me to speak this evening.